Before the video gets started today, I would like to give a special shout out to my patrons: Bernadette Reeve, Jacob Clancy, Katze der Nacht, Coley Claudette, Crow at theSOL, Minster Elana C. Henderson, Antonio Contreras, Kahlest Enoch, Ghost Eagle 1991, Howard Rholetter, Brian S. Morrow, Mathew Bergman, Jen Parsons, Jen M., the Schmeister, and Brenda Welby. Thank you all so much, and if you'd like a special shout out, consider becoming one of my patrons. And now, let's get into it. Alien abduction stories have existed for decades. In fact, the very first alien abduction story was recorded in the late 19th century. Colonel H.G. Shaw, whose account was published in the Stockton, California Daily Mail in 1897. Shaw claimed that he and a friend were harassed by 3 tall, slender humanoids, whose bodies were covered with a fine downy hair. The beings tried to accost or kidnap Shaw and his friend, who were able to fight them off. This is the first known-of account, as many people were and are still fearful of the repercussions they will receive as a result of telling their tales to anyone. Here are 8 people who were not afraid to share their alien abduction stories. Enjoy. This is a story of my father's. It happened in 1982 while my father was stationed on a military base in New Brunswick. One night, my father's best friend and his girlfriend left just after dark to go see Tron. There was no movie theater near the base, so they had a long drive ahead of them. They said goodbye to my father and left. About an hour later, my father's friend and his girlfriend were back on the base. The car pulled in and my father immediately noticed that it was damaged badly and covered in several colors of paint. My father asked them what had happened, why they had not gone to the movie. They brushed him off and went to bed. My father said they looked very shaken up. A few days later, my father got out of his friend what had happened. They said they were driving along a stretch of highway with not much around but trees and hills. When they rounded a bend, they noticed that a bunch of strange lights were coming from over a hill just ahead, where no lights should be because there was nothing around for miles. Just at the base of that hill was a parking lot for a park with some kind of narrow entrance. A bunch of cars were pulling into the parking lot to investigate the lights, so my father's friend pulled in too. Everyone got out of their cars and were about to start hiking to the top of the hill, when a large disc with flashing lights rose above the hill's peak, emitting a loud, strange sound. Everyone who was there ran for their car and tried desperately to crash their way out through the narrow entrance, as only one car could fit at a time. Cars scraped together, breaking parts off, transferring paint. My father's friends drove back to the base as fast as possible. My father's friend took him to the spot that had happened. There were car mirrors and other miscellaneous parts littering the parking lot. A few days later, men in black suits showed up on the base looking for people. They talked to my father's friend, then sent him on his way. My father asked him what the men wanted to see him for. They told him that he better shut the fuck up and not tell anyone about what had happened that night if he wanted to keep his military career. Back when I was an undergrad, I had a couple buddies who were big stargazers. One of them lived in a remote part of eastern Washington, where you could see everything clearly away from the light pollution. He invited me and another friend to visit his family for Thanksgiving one year. We said yes. So one night we went out into a field of knee-high grass and were looking up at the sky. It was really neat. We saw a bunch of shooting stars, when my friend suddenly pointed to a bright light in the sky and asked what it was. My other friend, the one interested in astronomy, didn't know. It looked kind of like a planet, but evidently there shouldn't have been any visible planets that night. I don't know enough about stars to know if this is true, so don't blame me. My friend was positive it wasn't a planet, though. It didn't really move, but rather bobbed in the sky, sort of bouncing up and down. Then, like a candle, it fizzled out. It literally looked like it burned up. That would have been weird by itself, but wasn't the weirdest part. We sort of thought nothing of it and were actually joking about seeing a UFO when we came across a guy in the middle of a field. I still have no idea how he got there, since we could see pretty far in all directions, and would have noticed him walking around. He was young, about our age. He wasn't wearing any shoes or a shirt, and as far as I could tell, was only wearing jeans. He was sitting curled up with his arms wrapped around his knees and shivering. Keep in mind it was the end of November, so no one would ever go out there without a shirt, much less a jacket. We were scared to approach him, so we asked him from far away if he was okay. He sort of stared at us blankly and said he was fine. He didn't sound drunk, but you could hear in his voice that he was cold. Eventually, we went over to him and asked how he got there. He said he didn't want to talk about it, and that he needed to go to the hospital. My friend called 911. Cops showed up with an ambulance at a nearby gas station we all walked to. I let him borrow my coat while we waited. He didn't really say anything, except he asked for our names and what we were doing. He also asked my friend about a couple constellations. The cops asked us a few questions, and paramedics took the dude away. I let him keep the jacket. My friend told the story to his family the next morning, and I remember I had forgotten all about the night. He made that connection, though. His family thought it was spooky, but figured we had just run into a junkie. This is a family story I've only heard twice. I can't remember how it was brought up the first time, but the explanation was so very vague. I asked again a few months later when the family had come together at the cottage during the summer. They seemed kind of off, iffy talking about it, but provided more details. Mind you, this was a few years ago, so I don't remember all the little intricacies. They live in the Ukraine but took a trip to Turkey sometime in the 90s. They had rented a little cottage that was far enough into the countryside to be considered fairly remote. Long story short, one evening the dogs outside started going absolutely crazy, barking viciously and just overall behaving erratically. One of them, my grandmother's brother, I believe, went outside to check on what was going on, and saw what they could only describe as a UFO nearing their cottage. Pretty high up in the sky, but lowering a bit as it came closer. He called for the rest of the family to come and see, and to this day they can still confirm what they saw. They said it was a triangle shaped and had 3 lights, one in each corner. When it got very close to the house, they began to panic and ran back inside. The walls were shaking. Dishes were breaking from the force of the vibrations going throughout the walls and the floors. The dogs outside were barking louder than ever. It hovered over the cottage for several minutes before ascending back up and disappearing. These are all people who are very conservative and rational, and they hate discussions regarding the supernatural, so I have no doubt in my mind that they were telling the truth. I was about 8 years old when I had the worst nightmare of my life. I was lying in bed when a dark figure climbed through my bedroom window. I was a master of pretending to be asleep. The perks couldn't be overlooked: missing CCD, mask, getting carried in from long car rides and tucked in. So I did the same as I was carried through my window. It felt so surreal. At this point I realized it was a dream, eyes still closed. I only had the sensation of ascension. I felt myself stop and open my eyes to a dark room with reddish lights. I can't properly describe it, as it was a long time ago, in a dreamy state, and plus it was just otherworldly. I felt just a soft pinch on the back of my left hand and the front of my right. Next thing I knew, I was back in my bed with the uncontrollable urge to cry. I ran downstairs to my babysitter and just cried in her arms. She did the classic, "It was just a dream," and obviously, I believed it. It wasn't until the next morning I noticed the scarring on the back of my left hand, as well as the noticeable metal, about the size of a small ball bearing, under the skin of my right palm. The next few years, the metal would often cause my skin to bubble up around it, cause warts, set off metal detectors, and confound every doctor I went to. It was noticeably more irritable in places like church, airports, next to circuit breakers, etc. I never got it removed because I was scared of being anesthetized, and I kind of liked feeling different having it there. 5 years after the incident, the metal fell out on its own, and now my skin is just slightly grayed there. I believe it was aliens with all my being. I also still have the scar on my left hand, though it has shrunken considerably. I had a chemistry professor in high school who was a very upright, respectable man. He coached the soccer team I played on. I have absolutely no reason to doubt this story, and he wasn't the kind of guy to joke about it anyway. When he was in college, he, his girlfriend, another friend, and that friend's dog were walking along the beach one warm night in Rhode Island. His friend and the dog ran into the dunes, leaving just my teacher and his girlfriend. And as they were sitting there, a bright light started moving across the sky, then rapidly got bigger as it approached them. Within a minute, a giant spaceship was hovering above the ocean. It hovered for 30 seconds, perfectly silent, then shot off again, rapidly shrinking and then disappearing in the distance. He and his girlfriend were absolutely flabbergasted. When the friend and his dog showed up, neither of them had seen or heard anything, though they were past the dunes and away from the beach. But here's the kicker. My teacher and his girl went back to his parents' house after, and immediately started telling them what they had saw. His skeptical parents devised a clever solution to prove if the story was true. They brought each of them into a different room, gave them a blank sheet of paper and a pen, and had them independently draw the ship they had seen. They both drew the exact same picture, with the same shape and ring of lights around the middle, and estimated its width and distance from the shore similarly. At this point, telling our class the story, my teacher drew the ship on the whiteboard for added visual effect, and it was a wide oval with a ring of lights in the middle and a bright light on the bottom. I'm not sure if alien abductions or whatnot are true, but hearing this guy tell this story was impressive. October of 2009. My dad calls me and says he wants to go camping for the weekend, and that he was leaving right away. This is 4 or 5 in the afternoon. I agree, he picks me up, and we head out to the Mogollon Rim. It gets dark before we get there and rains a little bit. Very weird vibe. We pass a stranded motorist, and we are usually the type to stop and help, but we decided against it. As we get close to the campsite, I see what I think is a tent with a lantern in it. It's glowing bright yellow-orange in the distance, a little lower in elevation than we are. As we keep driving, it doesn't seem to get any closer until it randomly moves and gets bigger. That's when we realize it isn't a tent. I tell him to stop the car. He does, and shuts off the lights. The light slowly gets bigger and kind of twists, and slowly moves from left to right. Then after about 2 to 5 minutes, it gets a little smaller, then shoots straight out to 12 o'clock until it wasn't visible anymore. When it left very fast. It lit up the forest. That's when I realized we were looking over the edge of the rim. We both agreed that we didn't know what the fuck it was. Probably an alien. Very shook up, we got to our destination, set up camp, and ended up having a great weekend. About 2 years ago, I was in Naples, Florida with my friend, staying at his dad's house. We were on the porch having a smoke around 11 p.m. I was leaning on the railing when suddenly what I thought was a plane in the distance turned toward us. It was flying so low that the front lights blinded us. My friend scrambled for his phone, which turned out to be dead, and I, fearing I would miss it, didn't want to run inside to grab my phone. Though the craft was steadily gliding, it was all happening so fast. As the object got closer, we noticed it was a huge triangle, almost venti black, and had 3 huge circular lights on the bottom. It was so close, just above the trees right in front of the building. It was so silent. The only thing making a sound were the trees rustling below the craft. Then the huge black triangle turned on a dime right in front of us and disappeared over the top of the buildings. I wouldn't have believed what I saw if I didn't see it with someone else. I was listening to the local radio station when all of a sudden it cuts out. Not sure if this was a coincidence, but it creeped me out. The static radio sound was left in the background. I got really scared of this stuff, so I thought I'd get my dad to come and fix the radio. However, I got up and gazed out of the window only to see all of the streetlights were off. Most streetlights tend to turn off by 3 a.m., which is why this is extra weird. I look up far into the sky and see 2 red and blue lines in the sky, standing completely still, motionless in the sky. My first thought was a military aircraft or something. I was 8, and I was obsessed with planes and UFOs. But what convinced me that there was something more to it was the fact that they started circling each other and eventually blasted off crazy fast into the sky, like the speed of light. They just turned into blurs. I might have been seeing things, but as soon as they left, the radio came back into tune. The streetlights turned back on, and I could now hear all the cars in the distance and the wind. When the UFOs were above my street, everything went silent. Well, what about you? Are you having strange dreams or nightmares of a similar scenario? Waking up with unexplained markings on your body? Did you glance up at the night sky and see something you will never forget? Did you try to tell someone about it, only to be laughed at or called crazy? Either way, it's a completely plausible reason to have your phone in your hands at all times, just in case you need a legitimate reason. See you next time.